Hi, Sanjeev and I are very close friends. We've been friends for many years, and what we've decided to do is to not ignore all of you, but just to have a chat, to talk about what drives Sanjeev Gardiner, how he believes is the future of tourism in Sri Lanka, and to crystal ball a little bit. Where is the country going? How is some of the more difficult questions going to play out? But I thought I'd start by asking my friend and Sanjeev, what drives him? What is your why? Why do you get up in the morning? What is it that drives you to personally take yourself to a different place?
Don't ask the easy questions too early. I think, to be honest, the Galle Hotel has been a part of our family for close of 100 years. We've been associated with the hotels. And my formative years, my father was my greatest single influence. And therefore, I reiterate, the Galle is a family company. It feels very much, and we run it in that way. We've been fortunate over the years to have some interesting folks pass through here. But what makes the Galle special, I think, is the spirit of what it is. And for me, preserving that element in this hotel is very important. It's what I would like to see for my kids and the future as well. In terms of passion for what Galle is to the city, but also to see how this city has grown. We've endured 30 years of civil conflict. We've lived through 2 world wars. This city has developed. We've seen this happen in the last 10 years. So that drives me. I love to see this city growing, changing, evolving.
And how much do you see the change that we were talking before we came, we were chatting earlier about youth and about change in Sri Lanka and how youth will continue to drive, will be the nexus, will be the formative element that's driving change in the country. How much do you see that youth as being the future?
Look, if you look at every major change that's impacted on our industry, it's come from somewhere we've not seen it, whether it's digital or what have you. And it's been driven by how you think differently. And if you spend time watching kids, the way they move with technology is part of their lives. For us, we need to work at it. That change has come. We must be conscious and proud of our history. We must be conscious of the present. But where we essentially need to be is in the future.
Right.
And it is the youth that sees that future way before us.
And do you see the youth in Sri Lanka as being a critical element that sets both internally and externally the country apart?
I think I am proudly Sri Lankan, and naturally I am proud of, I think we produce a phenomenal number of accountants. We have a lot of intellectual capabilities. A lot of our folks have gone to the US and other parts of the world and done very well. So I think the intellect is there, and that's important. But I think it's also very important to be cognizant, like Sri Lankans in the entire SAARC region, which is it's about a 2 billion population around us. One of the largest population growths in the world will take place in this region.
Right.
Because the population is very young, and that population will grow. That growth will foster change like we've never seen before. Perhaps in any part of the world, this kind of population growth has not taken place before. And it'll happen in the next 20 years.
But I'm particularly talking about, as I was mentioning earlier, I'm familiar with the think tanks that are coming out of MAS and who are now working at MIT in the States and at McGill. And there are different unusual, I would say, bubbles, pockets of Sri Lankan youth that, in my opinion, and for those of you who know me, I mean, I travel vastly around the region and in many different countries. In my opinion, that's one element that sets this country apart.
I'm delighted that you feel that way, and I am also proud. But I think that is going to be the new norm. And I think we have to reinvent ourselves. And more importantly, they have invested very heavily in leadership,
right?
Leadership training. That has to happen. We are a relatively small population of 20-odd million people. Therefore, hopefully, we could move more nimbly. We should.
Right.
And that's something that is an advantage that we could leverage.
And do you see that driving private enterprise, or do you see that metamorphosizing or changing, evolving the public institutions? How do you see that balance of private enterprise driving the future of the country?
I think private enterprise moves faster sometimes, and that gives them an advantage. But from a national policy level, there's a platform that has been done in skills development, and certain things have to be done. So we see about 3,000 to 5,000 rooms coming and being built around, but you need to have people to service that. We can't just keep poaching people from each other. That will have to have a natural progression. The thought process is it has to be a combination, but I think you'll see movement from the private sector much faster.
Right.
And I think,
do you see the private sector driving? I was talking yesterday in Bangkok about the same subject, and where in Thailand, for those of you who I'm sure are very familiar, tourism is kind of rampant. It's kind of out of control, and the numbers are out of control, and it's very difficult to harness the image of the country because of the impact of volume. We were again chatting about this slightly earlier. Given where Sri Lanka is, given where the development of Colombo is, given all of these factors, is it going to be private enterprise that drives the future, or will the government still reign control?
So I think it's very important that government gets certain policy issues right and sustainable so that it lays down those regulations and has a clear strategy laid out. The drive should, I think, come from the private sector. They can invest faster, move faster, and they will base it on returns and value. And therefore, it will be more sustainable. So,
can you dig deeper in that? Because I think it's fascinating, because I think whether it's your own company or Hiran or whomever it is, particularly in terms of tourism, but also if we start to imagine new world economies and sharing economies and technology impacting so massively and real estate and whatever else, how is private enterprise going to be so nimble and going to drive that formative image, perception of Sri Lanka? And I mean, if you take the analogy of Silicon Valley and the US, where Silicon Valley has, to a greater extent, certainly on the West Coast, driven the perception of what is America. That's a good one.
All right. Well, I think if you look at it this way, Mr. Binod Chaudhry is over there. He's a very kind partner with us in our rest house and villas which we've done around the country. That's the relationship that we've built. It's not just an investment. There's learnings that we get from each other a lot across the board. That is a decision that is not for a government to do, would be very difficult to do. Our relationships, whether it be with Mr. Binod Chaudhry, or we have a property in Kandy which is with the Ozo Group as well. There's a lot of learnings that we can do by tying up with even competitors or people who would be perceived as competitors.
Right.
We don't see it like that. But that's a personal choice that we've made and they've made to work with us.
And as a function of that, the perception.
So what I'm saying is, that allows a cross-pollination to germinate ideas and to do things which we would not otherwise have thought of.
And be more nimble.
That's right. Now, that doesn't work for everybody, but I do think in the right pockets, in the right places. So if you know a territory or you know where it's going to work, you should know that market well. Whether you can make it a brain trust, I don't know. That usually is germinated within the company or a set of companies. But the government's policy of needing to bring, okay, the key things for Sri Lanka would be the flights need to be cheaper to come here. That means the cost of getting here should be less. We can argue about room rates. As someone said, room rates are what people are prepared to pay for what they think they're going to get as value. That's the ultimate test. Having said that, you need to get the perception and the service right to get it there. But connectivity around the country becomes important. So the activation of some of our airports, which are not hugely difficult to do, some of the infrastructure that's being built, and it does take time. So the growth that we plan has to be strategic so that you don't have, say, 2 million people more on the roads without having the ability to transport them around.
Right.
And sometimes success has its price. So I think that's where the balancing has to take place, and that has to happen at policy level and work with partnership. That's why I said building hotel rooms alone will not get us there. There's a huge opportunity, I believe, in Sri Lanka for the food and beverage, for retail. All of these things add to the depth of the market. How many nights do you stay in Colombo? Why would you stay 2 more nights? What makes that interesting?
And again, let me go back to public-private. Do you think that's going to come from private? Do you think it's that initiative, that private enterprise initiative, that's going to stimulate incremental nights in Colombo, different experiences? Obviously, not the infrastructural airport developments that may be needed, but that kind of experience, that kind of incremental experience.
I think the initiatives will be driven by the private sector, but I don't think, as in the case of, say, India or some of the other, where there are giant conglomerates who can actually put in huge infrastructural funding to get that done. So we probably need a combination of strategic investment, local partnership, and government help. As long as the government becomes an enabling government to move things, and if they do so, I think Sri Lanka can take off very fast. For example, the ITC that's being built across the road is the first investment I believe they've made outside India, substantial investment.
Right.
And in many ways, it's good because they're a brand that's known there. They're putting their money here. Once they do put their footprint here, it is spread across the whole of the 1.3 or 1.2 billion population of India. That ITC is here. They have a hotel, and it's one of their best, right next to my good friend Mr. Chowdhury's Taj. Both hotel brands are known very well in India. But having 2 of them, the newest one here as well, will make an impact. It will reintroduce Colombo as a city to a whole population. Not that India is unaware of it, but there is hardly the traction from India that we need to have.
How is Colombo, Sri Lanka, managing its let's say volatile, not really volatile, but slightly precarious geopolitical situation in terms of its positioning between its neighbors and retaining and evolving its independence, particularly from a cultural point of view, particularly from a brand and from. You don't have to answer the question.
No, I think, look, we are in a very interesting place. We are on the base of India. We're 70 miles from India. We are a SAARC nation. China has substantial investments here, and they have continued to be having investments. We have interest from the Japanese, the Koreans. So I think Sri Lanka, as with any developing country, has to manage its relationships very well. It cannot ignore China, it cannot ignore Japan, cannot ignore the US. Our relationship with the US also has been reasonably good. So I think Sri Lanka has probably managed the relationships reasonably well. And I think it's trying to facilitate investments from all countries, so there is a even balance of it. And I think that's important for the sustainability of Sri Lanka. The natural relationship between India and Sri Lanka, history, culture, religion, many ways, is natural. The investment with China is based a lot on trade, but don't forget our relationships with China go back to 1950. We were one of the first countries to recognize that relationship all the way back then. So these are not new things necessarily. So I think we have always had to deal with larger countries, and we shall. But I think if we are able to make that work, and I think we can, Sri Lanka's growth can be exponential. I mean, we've not even tapped. You see, when we talk about youth, when you talk about growth, as I said, the largest population explosion is going to take place. It's a natural thing.
Right.
The youth, the people who earn that money, they need to spend money in places like Sri Lanka. And we have the potential right here. We are a seaside city. We have everything to make it work. We just need to have the focus and to manage the volumes.
Unquestionably, and this is from a professional point of view in terms of pure brand asset, Sri Lanka's greatest, most pristine, most magnificent asset is its culture. Surely it would be the further investment, the harnessing of that culture that is going to substantially elevate the nation in terms of its both the geopolitical thing we were talking about, but in all of its forms in terms of the future.
Okay. So when you ask me this question, Sri Lanka at one point was ruled by foreign powers for nearly 500 years. But it retained the key elements of its culture. Who are we and what is important to us? So I think there are fears that tourism can have an impact. But I think firstly a country needs to be very comfortable in who it is and be confident about that's what it is. And I think in Sri Lanka, they've endured that and they've still held that. I think that's important about our people, all our cultures. That said, I think that is its strength as well. So even when we develop tourism and whatever we are doing, as long as we are able to not fracture too many aspects of what makes us unique.
Right.
Because like in any business, it is the niche of who you are that will draw you to you. And what is special about Sri Lanka is this, the uniqueness of
and
what
ironic,
it is.
yeah, I totally agree. And I know from conversations I've had over the last 10 years with Binod, with Raul, with other, and I count myself as one of them, people who are outsiders who are really, really passionate. We love Sri Lanka. There's that core, and there are, and other people I'm sure sitting in the room who are the same. But there is this magnificence, this absolute, as I use the word pristine, this pristine beauty in the culture that still, in my opinion, is somewhat of a secret.
So some secrets are best kept secret. And I think people who know are in the know. And I think that is a unique part of what we can make special. For example, places like Galle, they organically grew. Dambulla, the East Coast, we're talking about surfers, they drove it. So,
Right.
When you have Lonely Planet picking you as a number one destination, the route, what's been picked is an organic growth. It's not a strategic one. It happened. Now, my point is that's a good guide to tell you what makes our country special, right? This is without the connectivity of the airports I'm talking about. So, as you plan this growth, we have to make sure that what makes us special doesn't get lost.
I agree with you.
In
I think,
commercialization.
and we're seeing this fairly ubiquitously and fairly suddenly now in Maldives, and has been ubiquitous and not that sudden in India, where international management company has taken away, one could argue, the internal beauty of of the individual hotel assets. Still in Sri Lanka, and I'm sure of great interest to people, to the guests in the room, it hasn't happened as ubiquitously or as wide, in such a widespread form in Sri Lanka. Is that going to change? And if not, why not?
Well, I can speak for myself. From the Golface group, whatever, we know what we would do ourselves. We know what we would do with strategic partners or management companies if you would develop a certain type of asset. I think the answer is very simple. We're still in a very early stage of our evolution. I think there's a strength in knowing certain niches, and you can play in the niche that you're strong in, and you can dominate a niche. The bigger chains will bring volume. They will bring with them marketing, everything, which will bring the country into focus. So destinations will become known because the brands will promote across. There is value in both. And I think the answer to your question is, increasingly people will see value in working with management companies which are tailored to their requirements. So assets will be built in a different way. So I think the key is you'll see us specialize, in my view, in certain niches or in core areas of strength.
Such as in wellness or in...
It could be wellness, it could be location, it could be geographical, it could be a nature trail. We are looking at experiential.
Right.
So it's a different set of things that you can be good at. Whereas the bigger chains have their core strengths, and they can actually use to build value and volume in specific destinations.
Do you privately, not necessarily as a businessman or as an entrepreneur, do you privately fear the distribution that big chains bring?
Not at all. What big chains have, you can't take away from them. So why should we be concerned by what we cannot control? What we can control is what we do and which niches we want to be relevant to. If we're not doing it well enough, then we've got to learn from them.
Do you think that there's still, I mean, I don't think it's a matter of conjecture, how much infrastructure has to develop in order to go to a substantially different level than where we are now?
Okay, so we have an airport that's already built in Mattala. We also have several air bases.
That's successful.
Well, it's not being used right now, right? But what I'm saying is activating things which will generate cheaper flights, more flights, and indeed connectivity around the country at a cheaper price will see value.
Would you advocate, for example, Lowcost, Mattala becoming a low-cost carrier airport, for example?
So I wouldn't advocate whether it be a low cost, but I think it can definitely be taken into cognizance of perhaps playing a regional play with the Indian market or the SAARC region. It could work more efficiently in distribution channels between, rather than having all the traffic going through Colombo or this thing, you could have the routes change. There are advantages, but connectivity to the airports and movement around the country can make it a far more, the spend in the country can increase substantially.
Just going back to the management company question, Golface is obviously and your family's legacy and one of the great grand dames of the world, let alone in the region. Were you ever tempted for it to become a Peninsula or a Raffles or such like?
So I remember in the 1970s, late 70s, my father negotiated with regents. He was a regent at one point. We had Raffles with us. Richard Helfer still remains a close friend, our close friend. We have talked to management. We have talked to a lot of the groups.
I'm sure they would all be very interested.
Yeah. But, you know, I lived through those conversations, and we spent a whole lot. My father and I were very close. I was very young. But at some point, my father passed away in 1996, and at that point, I decided that you have to make a decision. Either you hand it out to a management company or you run it. And forgive me, there's no reflection on any management company, but it's something my father and I discussed. Does the dog wag the tail or the tail wag the dog? And that's the decision that you really need to make for yourself. And for me, I think it was the decision at that point was, no, we'll do it ourselves. It's what we, for this company, and for some of the assets that we feel are very close to us personally.
Sanjeev, as we're talking, and maybe in some ways personal, but you've said it, does the tail wag the dog or the dog wag the tail? This is the core. It's not just, this is your life. This hotel, as I've known you for many, many years, has always been both emotional, pragmatic, but it's also driven your own personal values. How much of the values that you've harnessed, that you care so deeply for from the hotel, from your father, how have those values driven your other businesses, be in hotel or elsewhere? And what are they, and how has that manifested?
Well, I would say that the Golf Face kept my attention in the leisure space for probably 10 years or 15 years more than I would have otherwise if it was not the Golf Face. Right. We've looked at investments in our other businesses, which are in manufacturing investment, all of that stuff, quite a lot later, thanks to one of my other partners who brought that decision to us, and we invested in those businesses. So now we have a different spectrum of things to look at. But Golf Face still remains very much part of the heart. So if you cut me, I'll bleed GFH.
You've always said that. But what in terms of values, what values that you take from the blood of GFH, what values do you take from those that drive your other businesses?
I think we lived through 30 years of conflict. We had a situation, I believe in 1989, where we had 600 staff and 2 guests in the hotel. But we didn't close. So my point is that there are things you will do because they will be done. And this hotel will be here after I'm dust. That is what Golf Face is to me. It is just beyond me or something that is, it's not a hotel. And I think we have staff who worked here. Kuttan was our oldest staff member. He was 73 years working for the hotel. We have people who've worked here for 3 generations. That matters to me. It's becoming increasingly difficult, but that does matter to me.
I think there's no question. I came in late last night, and I'm sure for like anyone, many of us who stay here often, it's coming home. It is not a hotel. It's absolutely not a hotel. For you, if you crystal ball a little bit into the future, in terms of your own businesses and your role within Sri Lanka, as there would obviously, and I'm sure and I know you've been asked many times to take a more public position, and I know you would say you would not do that. But what, if you look forward over the next 5 to 10 years as to your role within the country and in terms of developing tourism and developing business in Sri Lanka, what's that going to be?
You don't believe in asking easy questions.
What's the point? It's otherwise for everyone. They'll sit and look at their phones.
The development in Sri Lanka and the pace and the rate of this growth will be exponential. Okay? It is not something that you would see today for a given set of reasons, but when it comes, it will come a lot faster than we would imagine. I'm talking the port city, what you see happening here, plus what is waiting to happen. The growth in India's population, the wealth growth in this region it's like a waterfall that is going to come. The key will be, how do we channel that flow? And
what would your role be?
The one that I can... From my perspective, I think it's looking at, we'd always look at the interest of not only our company, but we'd also look at the interest of Sri Lanka. So I think if, in terms of contribution, the private sector and public sector will have to work very closely. Right. That's going to happen. I don't want to say anything more than that.
Tilan is here, isn't he? He's going to talk about it.
Yeah, Tilan, you're probably a much better guy to answer that question.
According to the clock that's in front of us, we're supposedly out of time. I mean, are there any questions? Does anyone have any? I should have asked earlier. Does anyone have any questions for my esteemed guest?
Good.
Okay, then my final question will be, I'm running around the same circle. What will your legacy be?
I'll tell you what,
Just
I'll just follow my passion and let people write legacy for that. I mean, I don't think defining a legacy is not what I would like to do. I like to follow my passions.
Well, I think, thank you, Sanjeev, and thank you for your candor and your honesty. And I'd like to ask the audience to thank Sanjeev for doing a very precious interview. He doesn't normally do this, so we thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure. Thank you.